The first sign of trouble came in the form of a passive-aggressive letter taped to my front door. Bold red ink scrawled across the top read, "Violation notice." I sighed before even opening it. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Eleanor Grayson, the HOA president, had too much time on her hands and a vendetta against me. I tore the letter open and read it. Apparently, my trash cans were out of compliance. According to Eleanor, I had placed them too close to the curb the night before collection, which was against some obscure rule buried in the HOA's ridiculous bylaws. I glanced around. My neighbors had all done the same thing, yet I was the only one getting fined. Typical. I crumpled the letter and tossed it onto my kitchen counter. I wasn't about to pay some bogus fine just because Eleanor had a personal grudge. I had bigger things to worry about, like my job and the fact that my weekend was supposed to be relaxing, not spent dealing with HOA nonsense. The next morning, I woke up to the unmistakable stench of garbage. I stepped outside and froze. My entire front lawn was covered in trash, banana peels, coffee cups, food wrappers, even a few broken-down cardboard boxes. My stomach twisted in anger. This wasn't some random prank. This was deliberate, and I knew exactly who was behind it: Eleanor Grayson. I marched down the street toward the HOA office, shoving open the door with more force than necessary. Eleanor sat behind her desk, her manicured fingers tapping against a stack of papers. She didn't even bother to look surprised when she saw me. "Ah, Mr. Kendrick Palmer," she said smoothly. "Is there an issue?" "You dumped garbage on my lawn," I said, my voice tight. Eleanor let out a fake laugh, tilting her head in mock confusion. "Oh, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if there's trash on your property, you might want to check the HOA guidelines about maintaining a clean exterior. We wouldn't want another fine, now would we?" I clenched my fists, taking a deep breath to keep from saying something that would land me in trouble. Eleanor had been targeting me for months: fabricated violations, random inspections, even a complaint about the color of my front door. But this was personal. I took one step closer, lowering my voice. "You think you can get away with this?" she smiled, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "I have no idea what you're accusing me of, Mr. Palmer, but if you'd like to file a complaint, I'd be happy to take it into consideration." That was it. I was done playing nice. I turned on my heel and walked out, already forming a plan. Eleanor wanted a fight. She was about to get one. And when I was finished, she'd regret ever messing with me. I didn't go straight home after leaving the HOA office. Instead, I drove to the city's municipal building and walked into the records department. If Eleanor wanted to play dirty, I was going to dig up every piece of leverage I could find. The clerk at the front desk, an older man with thick glasses, glanced up as I approached. I explained that I needed to look up the HOA's financial records and bylaws. He nodded and led me to a dusty archive room filled with filing cabinets and stacks of documents. After thanking him, I got to work. An hour in, I hit gold. Buried in the financial reports was a pattern of misappropriated funds. The HOA had been collecting hefty maintenance fees from residents, but a significant chunk of that money wasn't going where it was supposed to. Instead, it had been funneled into absurd personal expenses: lavish dinners, spa treatments, and of course, a suspiciously high reimbursement for business travel. All of it traced back to Eleanor and her inner circle. I took pictures of every document that showed discrepancies, making sure I had enough evidence to build a case. Then I turned to the HOA bylaws, flipping through them until I found a crucial clause. Any board member proven to be engaged in financial misconduct could be forcibly removed by a resident vote. That was all I needed. Eleanor had spent years throwing her weight around, but now I had something that could bring her down. Armed with my new information, I drove home to clean up the mess in my yard, but I wasn't about to let Eleanor's stunt slide. If she wanted to play with garbage, I'd return the favor. That night, I grabbed a pair of gloves and started gathering every piece of trash she had dumped on my property. I made sure to bag it carefully, ensuring not a single scrap was left behind. When I was finished, I loaded the bags into my truck and drove straight to the HOA office. The building was dark, locked up for the night, but that didn't stop me. I set the bags down right in front of the entrance, making sure to spread the contents out just enough to make a statement. Coffee cups, banana peels, food wrappers, it was all right there, a perfect mirror of what she had done to me. Then, for the finishing touch, I printed out copies of the financial records I had found earlier and taped them to the front door. Let the whole neighborhood see exactly where their money was going. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. Neighbors were texting, sending pictures of the mess at the HOA office, asking if I knew anything. I simply replied that maybe Eleanor needed to review the rules about keeping common areas clean. By noon, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting. I made sure to be there, sitting in the front row as Eleanor stormed in, her expression livid. She tried to regain control, but the moment residents started asking about the financial records, she faltered. I let the neighborhood do the talking. People were furious about the misuse of funds, demanding answers. Eleanor stammered through weak excuses, but it was clear her grip on power was slipping. Then I stood up and presented the bylaw clause I had found. If enough residents signed a petition, we could vote to remove her. The room erupted into murmurs. People looked at one another, nodding in agreement. Eleanor's face paled. For the first time, she realized she was losing. That was the moment I knew I had won. Eleanor's grip on the HOA presidency was slipping, and she knew it. As the emergency meeting unraveled into chaos, her usual air of superiority crumbled under the weight of the accusations piling up against her. Residents were furious, demanding explanations she couldn't provide. Instead of addressing the financial discrepancies, she attempted to regain control in the only way she knew how: by doubling down. She slammed a gavel against the table, her voice cutting through the shouting. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, her face flushed with frustration. "Any allegations against me or this board are baseless. We will reconvene once a proper investigation is conducted." The problem for Eleanor was that residents weren't buying her act anymore. She had ruled through intimidation and manipulation for too long, and now, with real evidence in hand, people were beginning to see her for what she truly was. I didn't push further, at least, not yet. I had already set the wheels in motion, and I knew that forcing her into a corner now would only make her more reckless. Instead, I left the meeting with a quiet confidence, knowing that she was already scrambling to cover her tracks. That night, I prepared the next step. The financial records I had found were just the beginning. I needed more, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or clerical error. So, I did what any rational person would do. When dealing with a corrupt HOA, I started digging deeper. The first thing I did was reach out to a few former residents who had mysteriously moved out over the past 2 years. Some had left without a word, while others had sold their homes under suspicious circumstances. After a few phone calls, I found a couple who were more than willing to talk. They had been hit with constant fines, just like I had. Eleanor had targeted them over petty violations: grass being too high, their car parked an inch too far from the curb, even a supposed noise complaint for playing music at a reasonable volume. When they contested the fines, their fees mysteriously increased. And then, when they refused to pay, the HOA threatened legal action, forcing them to sell their home at a loss just to escape the harassment. It was a pattern one Eleanor had perfected over the years. She would single out homeowners who didn't fall in line, slap them with fines until they couldn't keep up, and then pressure them into selling. And if they refused, the HOA had ways of making life unbearable. I recorded everything. The couple provided old letters, emails, and even a few voicemails from Eleanor herself, making veiled threats about compliance and consequences. It was exactly what I needed. With this new evidence in hand, I contacted a lawyer. I wasn't just going to take Eleanor down, I was going to dismantle her entire operation. The next day, I filed a lawsuit against the HOA, citing financial misconduct, harassment, and fraudulent fines. My lawyer assured me that with the amount of documentation I had, Eleanor wouldn't have a leg to stand on. News of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before now felt emboldened, coming forward with their own horror stories. The list of grievances grew longer by the hour, and soon, the HOA board found itself under siege from its own community. Eleanor, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. She tried playing the victim, claiming that this was all a coordinated attack against her leadership. She even attempted to hold a damage control meeting, urging residents to stand together against what she called a malicious smear campaign. But her usual tactics weren't working anymore. People weren't afraid of her now that they knew the truth. Then, just when I thought she had run out of tricks, she made one last desperate move and attempt to sabotage my case. One morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, informing me that my property was now under review for multiple infractions, and that I was facing potential legal action from the board. I laughed when I read it. She was trying to intimidate me, but it was far too late for that. Instead of backing down, I made sure to escalate the situation further. I invited every affected resident to a public meeting at a local community center. We gathered evidence, shared stories, and solidified our collective case against the HOA. By the time we were done, we had enough testimonials to bury Eleanor and her cronies under a mountain of lawsuits. The final blow came when local news stations caught wind of the scandal. A reporter showed up at Eleanor's door, microphone in hand, asking her to comment on the allegations. She slammed the door in their faces, but the damage was already done. The lawsuit proceeded swiftly. Under legal scrutiny, the HOA's financial records exposed years of embezzlement and abuse of power. Eleanor was forced to resign in disgrace, and the HOA board was dissolved, replaced by new leadership elected by the residents. As for me, I made sure Eleanor got a taste of her own medicine. On the day she officially stepped down, I gathered every piece of HOA-related paperwork, every bogus fine, and every fraudulent notice she had ever sent me. Then, I drove to the HOA office one last time. With a sense of satisfaction, I walked straight into the lobby, dumped the entire stack onto the floor, and turned to the new rightful HOA board with a single statement: "Clean up your mess." And with that, I walked out, knowing that justice had finally been served. Eleanor's downfall had been swift, but the chaos she left behind took time to clean up. With her and her cronies ousted from the HOA, a temporary board had been put in place to restore order. But fixing the damage she had caused wasn't as simple as just removing her name from the paperwork. Residents were still wary, and there was a lingering distrust toward the HOA as a whole. People wanted to know if the new leadership would truly be different, or if they were just inheriting the same corrupt system under a new banner. I had no intention of joining the board, but that didn't mean I was done holding them accountable. The lawsuit had exposed the financial fraud, but there were still unanswered questions about where some of the missing money had gone. The audit revealed that certain transactions had been deliberately concealed, and while Eleanor had been forced to pay back a large portion, there were still gaps in the records that suggested she hadn't acted alone. The new board, now led by a no-nonsense retired accountant named Linda Holloway, had promised transparency. She had personally reached out to me, acknowledging the work I had done in exposing Eleanor and asking if I would help oversee the transition. I wasn't interested in a formal position, but I did agree to review the remaining financial records alongside a few other residents who had business and legal backgrounds. What we found confirmed my suspicions. There were discrepancies not just in the HOA's general fund, but also in the way contracts had been awarded for maintenance and landscaping. Several companies that had supposedly been hired to do work never actually existed, and payments had been made to shell accounts that didn't trace back to Eleanor directly. Someone else had been benefiting from this scheme, and if I had learned anything from dealing with Eleanor, it was that people like her rarely worked alone. I wasn't about to let whoever was behind this slip away. Linda agreed that we needed to dig deeper before presenting anything to the community. If there were still people within the HOA's network trying to cover their tracks, we had to be careful about how we exposed them. We decided to quietly bring in an independent forensic accountant to go over everything with a fine-toothed comb. Meanwhile, I kept my ear to the ground. The neighborhood was still buzzing from Eleanor's removal, and I knew that if anyone had information, it would eventually slip out. Sure enough, it didn't take long before I started hearing whispers about a certain former board member who had suddenly gone quiet. Greg Thompson. He had been Eleanor's right-hand man, always backing her decisions without question. While she had been the face of the HOA's tyranny, he had been the one handling much of the paperwork. At first, people assumed he had simply disappeared after the scandal, trying to distance himself from the fallout. But I noticed something odd. While Eleanor had been publicly disgraced, Greg hadn't faced the same level of scrutiny. He hadn't been named in the lawsuit, and he had conveniently resigned just before the full extent of the financial fraud had been exposed. It was too perfect. I decided to pay Greg a visit. I wasn't expecting him to be cooperative, but I had a feeling that if I pushed the right buttons, he might slip up. When I arrived at his house, it was clear he wasn't expecting visitors. His yard, once meticulously maintained, was starting to look neglected. There were unopened HOA notices stuffed into his mailbox, a cruel irony considering how many he had probably issued himself. I knocked on the door. After a long pause, Greg opened it just enough to see who was standing outside. The moment he recognized me, his expression hardened. "I don't have anything to say to you," he said, starting to close the door. I planted my foot against it before he could shut it completely. "That's funny, because I think you have a lot to say. Like how your name keeps popping up in the HOA's financial records." Greg's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I had nothing to do with that mess. Whatever Eleanor did, that was on her." I folded my arms. "That's interesting, because some of the accounts that received payments were linked to businesses registered under your name." His face paled. That was the reaction I was looking for. "I'd be very careful about what accusations you throw around," he said, his tone shaking slightly. "You don't have proof." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the records we had found before holding the screen up for him to see. His name, attached to multiple fraudulent transactions, was displayed clear as day. "I think this says otherwise," I said. He swallowed hard, stepping back into the house. I followed, shutting the door behind me. Greg let out a long breath, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, I wasn't the one calling the shots. Eleanor handled everything. I was just following orders. I didn't even see most of the money. She told me it was standard practice." I narrowed my eyes. "Standard practice? You signed off on fake contracts. You moved money into accounts that didn't exist. That's not just following orders, Greg, that's fraud." He sank onto his couch, rubbing his temples. "Fine, you want the truth. Eleanor might have been the face of it, but the real mastermind was her husband." That was unexpected. "Her husband?" I repeated. Greg nodded. "Charles. He was never on the HOA board, but he was the one pulling the strings. He used his connections to set up the fake companies, and Eleanor made sure the payments went through. I was just the middleman." I had never paid much attention to Charles Grayson. He had always been in the background, a quiet presence at HOA events, never drawing attention to himself. But now it made sense. Eleanor had been the perfect shield, loud, confrontational, and arrogant enough to take the heat while he worked in the shadows. Greg sighed. "Look, I don't want any part of this anymore. If you take this to the authorities, I'll cooperate. Just don't make me the scapegoat." I wasn't about to let Greg off the hook completely, but his information was valuable. I left his house knowing exactly what my next move would be. If Charles thought he could get away with it while letting Eleanor take the fall, he was about to be proven very, very wrong. I left Greg's house with my next move already mapped out in my mind. The real threat wasn't just Eleanor, it was Charles. He had managed to stay out of the spotlight, letting his wife take the fall while he orchestrated the fraud from behind the scenes. But now, thanks to Greg's confession, I had a direct line to the real mastermind. I wasn't about to give Charles the chance to wiggle out of this. Instead of going straight to him, I met with Linda and the forensic accountant we had hired. We combed through the remaining financial records, this time focusing on any transaction that linked back to Charles. It didn't take long before we found what we were looking for. There were payments made to companies that didn't exist, just like Greg had said. But what stood out were the property's vacant lots and rental homes purchased under shell corporations. The HOA funds had been siphoned into these purchases, hidden under the guise of community improvement projects that never materialized. Charles hadn't just been stealing, he had been laundering the money through real estate. Linda was furious. For years, she had trusted the HOA leadership to act in the best interest of the community, only to find out that it had been run like a criminal enterprise. We compiled everything into a report and made 2 copies. One would go to the state's housing authority and the other would be handed directly to law enforcement. But before we submitted them, I wanted to confront Charles myself. I wasn't expecting him to admit anything, but I had a feeling that if I pressed him, he would slip just like Greg had. I found Charles exactly where I expected, at the country club on the far side of town. He was sitting on the patio, sipping a drink like he didn't have a care in the world. I walked right up to his table and pulled out the chair across from him. He looked up, raising an eyebrow like I was some minor inconvenience interrupting his day. "This is a private club," he said coolly. I leaned forward. "So is embezzling HOA funds, but that didn't stop you." His expression barely flickered, but I caught the slight shift, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers paused over his glass. He wasn't expecting me to come after him directly. "I don't know what you think you've found," he said, setting his drink down, "but I'd be very careful about throwing around accusations." I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table between us. The screen displayed a list of transactions, all leading back to his shell companies. Charles exhaled slowly, glancing at the files before meeting my gaze again. "You don't understand how business works, do you? Investments, property development, it's complicated. These were legitimate transactions." I tilted my head. "Legitimate? Then I'm sure you won't mind explaining why the HOA was paying maintenance fees to companies that don't exist." His fingers drummed against the table. "This is nothing more than an attempt to smear my name." "You have no proof that I personally handled any of this." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Greg already told me everything." That got him. His fingers stopped moving, his shoulders tensed just slightly. He had counted on Greg staying quiet, but that was no longer the case. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment. "What do you want?" There it was. I had him on the defensive. "I want you to return every stolen dollar to the community," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I want you to step forward and admit what you did before the authorities come knocking." Charles let out a low chuckle. "You think you can strong-arm me into a confession? That's not how the world works." I slid my phone back into my pocket. "You're right. But law enforcement doesn't need a confession when they have a paper trail leading straight to you." He remained silent, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. I stood up. "You've got 2 choices. You can come clean now and try to make some kind of deal, or you can wait until the authorities show up at your door. Either way, this ends with you facing consequences." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting there silent. By the time I got back to the neighborhood, the wheels were already in motion. Linda and I submitted the financial reports to the authorities, and within days, an official investigation was launched. Charles tried to disappear, but it was too late. The state's financial crimes unit froze his assets, and the IRS started digging into his real estate holdings. When the investigators arrived at his doorstep, he had no choice but to surrender. As for Eleanor, she had already been drowning in legal trouble, but with Charles exposed, her involvement became even clearer. They had worked together, manipulating the HOA for years, bleeding the community dry while pretending to enforce rules for the greater good. The fallout was massive. Residents who had been unfairly fined received refunds, and the HOA was completely restructured under new, transparent leadership. The best part, watching Charles and Eleanor's house go up for auction after their assets were seized. I made sure to attend the open house, just to enjoy the irony. Watching their empire crumble was the perfect ending to their reign of corruption. With Charles and Eleanor finally facing the consequences of their corruption, the neighborhood had started to breathe again. The tension that had once hung over the community like a storm cloud was lifting. People who had been too scared to speak up before were now openly discussing the years of harassment and manipulation they had endured. Homeowners who had been bullied into selling were reaching out, some even considering legal action against the former HOA board. Linda and the newly elected board wasted no time implementing reforms. The first order of business was eliminating the absurd fines and restrictions that Eleanor had used to control the residents. No more arbitrary inspections, no more bogus violation notices, and most importantly, no more unchecked financial authority. Every major expense now required community approval, and independent auditors would review the HOA's finances annually. One afternoon, Linda invited me to a community meeting, the first one under the new leadership. The difference was night and day. Instead of the usual atmosphere of fear and resentment, people actually wanted to be there. They were engaged, asking questions, offering suggestions, and most importantly, taking back control of their own neighborhood. As I sat in the back, watching the discussions unfold, Linda caught my eye and gave me a nod of appreciation. I hadn't done this alone, but I had played a part in making it happen, and that felt good. But the real victory came when the legal proceedings against Charles and Eleanor reached their final stage. With the overwhelming evidence against them, they had no choice but to take plea deals. Charles admitted to embezzling funds and faced a hefty financial penalty along with a ban from ever participating in HOA governance again. Eleanor, on the other hand, had also been hit with civil suits from multiple former homeowners, forcing her to sell off her remaining assets to cover the damages. Their once pristine home, the very symbol of their tyranny, was seized and auctioned off. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same woman who had threatened people over minor infractions had now lost everything because of her own greed. On the day the auction was held, a group of residents gathered outside, watching as strangers walked through what had once been Eleanor's fortress of power. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, not out of cruelty, but out of justice finally being served. One of the neighbors, an older man who had lived in the community for over 20 years, turned to me with a chuckle. He said that in all his years, he had never seen the HOA held accountable like this. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the neighborhood belonged to the people again, not a power-hungry few. As for me, I had no regrets. I never wanted to be involved in HOA politics, but when push came to shove, I wasn't about to let anyone bully me out of my own home. And in the end, standing up hadn't just freed me, it had freed the entire community. With Eleanor and Charles gone, the neighborhood had a fresh start. And this time, we weren't going to let anyone take it away from us.